The night sky over Sorrel Creek turned the wrong shade of orange, as if heaven itself wanted to scrape every living thing off the land beneath it. 8 years later, a gray-haired woman pushed through the doors of the rusted spur, and in 3 seconds both revolvers of the fastest gun between there and Cheyenne hit the plank floor, spun once, and came to rest well past his reach. Wyatt Sloane stared at his own empty hands like they belonged to a stranger. Whiskey still dripped from the brim of her hat. She never once blinked. In her saddlebag she carried a fragment of charred wood, small enough to close inside one fist. Why would a woman cross 3 territories to keep a burned scrap of an unfinished cradle? 5 names already lay in the ground behind her, every one of them for a son named Caleb she'd buried on a rise above the creek. But the 6th name had just whispered something, and before the sun set twice more, everything she'd believed for 8 years would come apart in her own hands. Who was she really hunting? Harlan's Notch didn't have a sheriff. Didn't have a judge either. Didn't have a courthouse, a jail, a church bell, anything that might have told a man where the line sat before he crossed it. What it had was gold. Raw and plentiful, pulled out of the creek beds by men who'd walked away from farms and families, and failed harvests back east, chasing a rumor that this particular stretch of Wyoming territory might finally be the one that paid off. The camp had grown fast that summer and faster that fall. Tents first, canvas stretched over green pine poles still weeping sap. Then rough lumber, hauled in by freight wagon at prices that would have scandalized any town, with a proper mill nearby. By September there were 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, a boarding house, with rooms that rented for more than a month's wages back in whatever state a man had come from, and a main road that turned to standing mud every time it rained, which in that country was more often than anybody liked. And where there's gold, and no law, something else always moves in to fill the gap. That fall, in 1879, the something else wore a black hat, and carried 2 revolvers, and answered to the name Wyatt Sloane. He was 25 years old. Looked older some days the way certain men do, when they've spent years performing a hardness that eventually stops being a performance, and starts being the only face they have left. Looked younger on others, especially when the whiskey wore thin toward the end of a long night, and something flickered behind his eyes that didn't belong to a man of 25 at all. Something closer to a boy who'd wandered into a room he didn't know how to leave. Nobody in camp asked about that flicker. Nobody asked much of anything about Wyatt Sloane, because asking questions of a man like that came with a cost, and everybody in Harlan's Notch had already learned exactly what that cost looked like. A miner named Otis Purnell had asked one question, back in June, about why Sloane never seemed to pay for his drinks. Purnell left camp 2 days later, with a broken hand, and a story that didn't match the injury, and after that, nobody in Harlan's Notch asked Wyatt Sloane anything at all, unless the asking was phrased as flattery. He held court most evenings at the Rusted Spur, a saloon built from green lumber that still smelled of pine sap, the boards not yet warped by a full winter, the bar itself still bearing the pale unweathered stripe, where a carpenter's plane had passed over it only months before. Sloane sat center table like he owned the deed to the whole building, though he didn't own a thing in Harlan's Notch except fear, and fear, as it turned out, was the only currency that mattered in a camp, with no badge to enforce anything else. Miners bought his drinks, before he lifted a finger to ask. The faro dealer waved off his losses rather than collect what the house was owed. And when Sloane laughed at his own jokes, laughed loud and long, into the smoke-thick air, the whole table laughed with him. Not because the jokes were funny. Because silence, in that particular room, was its own kind of risk. That was the town Sloane had built for himself in 4 short months. A kingdom made of borrowed courage, and other men's fear, propped up on nothing sturdier than the fact that nobody had tested it yet. Nobody, that is, until the woman on the sorrel horse rode in on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, tied her animal to the rail outside the spur, and walked in like she had nowhere particular to be. Her name was Billy Hargrove. 58 years old. gray threading heavy through hair that had once been the color of wheat stubble in October, back when there had still been a ranch, and a husband, and a boy learning to sit a saddle, before he'd learned to properly walk. She wore a canvas duster gone soft, and pale at the shoulders, from years of sun, and underneath it, a revolver she hadn't drawn on a living soul in almost 11 months. Which didn't mean she'd forgotten how. She'd ridden 3 days to reach Harlan's Notch. Followed a rumor that had traveled through 2 territories before it ever reached her ears. A gunslinger working the gold camps, young for his reputation, a habit of humiliating strangers, before he ever bothered drawing on them. She'd heard versions of that story in Cheyenne from a bartender, who swore the man had put a bullet through a card table just to watch grown men flinch. Heard it again outside a railhead in Nebraska, from a woman selling coffee out of a wagon, who described a scar cutting through one eyebrow with the particular certainty of somebody who'd seen it up close and never forgotten. Heard it a third time, 3 weeks back, from a freight driver at a river crossing, who wouldn't meet her eyes while he told it, the way men sometimes couldn't, when a memory had frightened them worse than they wanted to admit out loud. None of the tellings agreed on much. Not the man's height, not his age, not the particular color of the horse he rode. Rumors traveled that way, gathering embellishment the way a river gathers silt, until the truth at the bottom of them got harder and harder to see clearly. Except one detail. A scar, thin and pale, cutting through the left eyebrow, present in every single telling no matter how much the rest of the story shifted and blurred around it. Billy had carried that detail for 8 years. Long enough that she sometimes wondered, riding into yet another camp on yet another rumor, whether she was chasing a real man anymore, or just chasing the shape of her own grief, dressed up as a manhunt, because grief alone had nowhere to put its hands. Grief needed a task. Needed a direction. And for 8 years Billy Hargrove had given hers exactly that, one dusty road, and one uncertain rumor at a time. She told herself, tying her horse off outside the spur, that she'd come in for coffee. For a hot meal. A chair that wasn't a saddle for an hour or 2, and maybe a night's sleep on something that didn't sway under her the way a horse's back did, after 3 straight days of hard riding. That was only half true. It had been half true in Cheyenne as well. And in Nebraska. And in every camp, before those, going back 8 years to a morning she still saw clear as glass whenever she closed her eyes for too long, a morning with a wrong-colored sky, and a smell that never fully left the back of her throat no matter how many seasons passed. She crossed the boardwalk, boots quiet on the raw planking. Pushed through the doors. Inside, the air sat thick, with cigar smoke, and the sour tang of spilled liquor, layered over the ever-present dust of a camp still being built board by board around its own ambitions. She found a table near the back wall. Sat with her back to the corner, out of long habit rather than any specific fear, the particular positioning of a person who had learned, somewhere along a hard road, that a wall at your back bought you time other people didn't have. Ordered coffee instead of whiskey, because whiskey slowed a hand, and she'd learned a long time ago never to slow her hand in a room full of strangers. She found Sloane inside of a minute. And something old and cold dropped low in her chest, before she'd even finished working out why. The scar. Right where the rumors placed it, catching the lamplight at a particular angle. When he turned his head, a thin pale line she'd have known blindfolded, if a hand had ever let her trace it. The laugh. Pitched high and easy, a young man's laugh, carrying across the room the way a particular kind of laugh had once carried across a yard, 8 years back, moments before that yard went up in smoke and flame. She hadn't heard that exact pitch of laughter since. Hadn't wanted to. And hearing it now, in a saloon 3 territories, and 8 years removed from Sorrel Creek, felt like being struck somewhere below the ribs, where no fist had actually landed. She kept her eyes mostly on her coffee cup, watching the steam curl up off it in the smoky air, and let the rest of the room fill in what she needed. Sloane sat like a king holding audience. Miners leaning in close around him, laughing too readily at jokes that weren't especially funny. None of them meeting his eyes for longer than a second at a stretch, the way men avoid looking directly at something that might notice them noticing. That was fear, dressed up as friendship. She'd watched 100 bullies wear that same costume in 100 other rooms across 100 other camps, and it told her everything she needed to know about how Sloane had spent his 4 months in Harlan's notch, and everything she needed to know about how many more months he intended to keep spending them exactly the same way, if nobody stopped him. He noticed her within the hour, because every other man in that saloon had spent the afternoon performing some small deference toward his table. A nod, a shifted chair, a drink lifted in his direction before it was drunk, and the quiet woman in the corner, hands folded around a coffee cup, hadn't so much as glanced his way once, not even the small sideways glances other patrons kept sneaking whether they meant to or not. To a man like Wyatt Sloane, that omission was its own kind of insult. And insults, in his particular version of Harlan's notch, always came with a bill attached. "You there?" His voice pitched loud enough to still half the room. "Old woman in the corner. You know who you're sitting 20 feet from." Billy lifted her eyes. Unhurried. Said nothing. Which only widened his grin. He rose. Crossed the room, with the easy swagger of a man who never once had that swagger seriously tested. Boots loud on the plank floor. The crowd parting around him the way water parts around a stone, and closes right back up behind it, everybody suddenly finding something interesting to look at, that wasn't the table in the corner. Fastest gun between here and Cheyenne. He stopped at her table. Looked down at her, with the particular contempt certain men reserve for anybody who fails to be afraid of them quickly enough. And you don't even have the manners to look impressed. Billy let a beat pass. Long enough that the silence started doing some of her work for her. Wasn't aware impressing you was part of the price of coffee. The room went quiet. Not all at once. In a wave, table by table, like somebody had pulled a cork out of the noise, and let it drain. Near the bar, a glass stopped mid-pour. A card fell face down, without anybody meaning to drop it. Sloane's grin didn't move. But something behind his eyes went flat. Hard. The look of a man recalculating a situation he'd assumed was already settled, before he'd even walked over to settle it, and finding, for the first time in a long while, that the arithmetic wasn't adding up the way it always had before. He reached back without looking. Lifted a full glass off the nearest table. Turned it slow over her head. Whiskey ran through gray hair. Dripped off the brim of her hat. Soaked into her collar, cold and sharp-smelling, running down toward skin that had weathered worse than a wasted glass of liquor. She didn't flinch. Because flinching was a debt paid to a man like this. And Billy Hargrove had stopped paying debts she didn't owe a long time ago, somewhere on a hard road between one grave and the next. Her hands stayed flat on the table. Her eyes stayed on his face. Steady. Reading every line of him the way a woman reads a page she's been waiting 8 years to finally turn, cataloging the shape of his jaw, the particular way his weight settled, the tell in his shoulders. That would come a half second, before his hand actually moved. The saloon erupted in laughter. The ugly kind. The kind a crowd makes, when it's relieved not to be the one currently getting humiliated, laughter with an edge of nervous release running underneath it. Sloane set the glass down hard enough to crack it. Leaned in close. Close enough she could smell the whiskey on his breath layered under the whiskey still dripping off her own hat. "Nothing to say, old woman?" "Said enough already." Her voice didn't rise. "Didn't need to. Just waiting on you to finish deciding what you're going to do about it." His hand dropped for his revolver. What happened next took less time than the laughter needed to fully die out. His fingers closed around the grip. And her hands closed over his wrist in the same instant. Both together. Turning the muzzle down toward the floor. Driving a thumb hard behind the trigger finger, until the weapon came loose entirely, slid across the table, spun once, landed well past either of their reach, skittering off the edge, and clattering onto the plank floor beyond. His other hand moved on pure reflex. Reaching for the second gun tucked at the small of his back. The one most of Harlan's notch didn't know he carried. The one that had settled more than one dispute, before his opponent even understood there was a second gun in play. She was already moving. Caught that wrist, before the hidden weapon cleared leather. Twisted it flat, until the gun dropped, unfired, onto the plank floor between them, a second dull metallic sound following the first. 2 guns gone. In the space of one held breath. The room had gone utterly silent. Even the piano player in the corner had let his hands go still on the keys, fingers hovering just above them, forgotten mid-chord. And Sloane stood there, staring at his own empty hands like they belonged to somebody else entirely. Like he'd woken up in the middle of a story he didn't remember agreeing to be part of. Sorrel Creek. Billy said it low. Just loud enough that the front tables caught it first. 8 years back. A horse ranch south of the territory line. All the color drained out of his face at once. Like a man watching a dead he'd stopped expecting ever come to finally walk through the door and sit down across from him, patient, unhurried, having waited the entire length of 8 years for exactly this moment. Near the bar, a rangy man in a duster gone gray at the elbows went still, over his drink. Silas Boone. A wagon coordinator who'd guided enough freight trains through the territory to have heard most of its darker stories at least twice, and who'd learned, over years of hauling cargo, through country with no law in it, to keep his own opinions carefully out of his face, until he understood exactly what kind of situation he was standing in the middle of. Sorrel Creek. He repeated it half to himself. The words landing somewhere he clearly hadn't expected to hear them spoken out loud again. Family there. Didn't make it. He didn't say more than that. Didn't need to. The name alone was already moving table to table faster than anybody could have shouted it across the room, whispered mouth to ear, the particular electric current that runs through a crowd the instant it senses the ground shifting under a story it thought it already understood. Sloane's knees didn't quite give out. Not yet. But something in his shoulders folded inward, the way a fence post folds, after enough years of frost work their way into the grain, and finally win. I was 17. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. All the swagger gone out of it now, replaced by something raw and young that hadn't been visible in that face a minute earlier. Rode because a man I trusted told me cruelty and courage were the same thing, if you did it in a big enough group. Told me it was just going to be a warning. Nobody ever said. He stopped. Couldn't finish it. The words running dry the way water runs dry out of a cracked cup, no matter how much a person tries to keep tipping it toward their mouth. And every year since. Billy didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. You chose to keep proving him right. For the first time, since she'd walked into the rusted spur, Wyatt Sloane looked less like a fast gun, and more like exactly what he'd been 8 years ago on that particular night. A scared boy who never once stopped being scared. Just gotten better, year over year, at hiding it behind a reputation nobody had bothered testing, until this particular afternoon, when a quiet woman, with a coffee cup, finally decided the testing was overdue. His knees gave out for real this time. He dropped hard into the chair behind him. Hands shaking visibly, the fine tremor of a man whose whole architecture had just been kicked out from under him. And for one long moment the whole saloon watched a legend come apart faster than it had ever been built, the way a sandcastle comes apart the instant the tide finally reaches it, all that careful construction undone in seconds by something that had been coming the entire time. Until Sloane, cornered, found the only weapon he still had left to swing. Ask her what happened to the other 5. Louder now. A shaking finger jabbed toward her across the table. Go on. Ask her. 5 names. 5 towns. Not one of them walked away from meeting her either. She hunted every last one down, and put them in the ground herself. I was 17, and scared out of my mind. What's her excuse? The mood of the room shifted. Subtle. But unmistakable. Because a crowd that had just watched one dangerous person get taken down doesn't always know what to do when it realizes it might be looking at a second one, sitting quietly in the corner, with a coffee cup, having ordered nothing stronger all afternoon. A miner near the faro table set his cards down slow. Somebody near the door murmured low to his neighbor. Even Boone's face had gone careful, weighing something he clearly hadn't expected to weigh tonight, his easy posture at the bar straightening by degrees. Billy didn't deny it. 5 names. Flat. Even. Every one of them answered for what they did that night. I told myself, after each one, it would settle something in me that hadn't settled since. It never did. Just gave me 5 more nights I remember exactly, as clear as the fire itself. She looked around the room. Met the doubt in it, without flinching from a single face, holding each pair of eyes just long enough to let them see she had nothing left to hide, from any of them. I'm not asking anybody here to think better of me for that. I did what I did. Carried it every day since. I'm only telling this room what I've already decided to do about the 6th name. Boone crossed the room. Picked up both of Sloane's revolvers off the floor. Checked the loads out of old habit, thumbing the cylinder around once, twice. Set them on the bar rather than hand them back to anyone just yet. Reckon that's fair to hear out. He said it loud enough for the whole room. Man's earned the right to explain the difference. Seeing as how she's the only one of the two of them who bothered admitting to anything at all tonight. Billy drew her own Colt. Slow. Deliberate. Thumbed back the hammer, the click of it loud in a room that had gone otherwise silent. Sloane went rigid. Certain, for one long airless second, that this was exactly how his night was going to end, in a saloon built from green lumber that still smelled like the forest it had come from, 300 miles, from anywhere he'd have chosen to die. Her hand trembled once. Visible. The first crack of real uncertainty she'd shown, since walking through those doors 3 days of memory ago, the tremor lasting no longer than a heartbeat, but visible to every eye trained on her. And then, instead of leveling the weapon, she turned it. Thumbed open the loading gate. Began pressing cartridges out one at a time. Setting each one down in a slow, deliberate row beside his empty, shaking hands, the brass catching the lamplight, 6 small cylinders lined up like something ceremonial. I killed 5 men believing each one would give something back. Working the last cartridge free. All it ever gave me was one more face I couldn't stop seeing behind my eyes at night. You're the last name on a list I've carried 8 years. And for most of that time, I mistook finding you for a reason to keep writing instead of a reason to finally stop somewhere and call whatever's left of my life a life again. She set the empty revolver down gently atop the small row of bullets. Killing you here wouldn't give me back one single day of what that fire took from me. It would just make me exactly what you've spent 8 years pretending you already were. Silence again. Different this time. Heavier. Because a room can hold 2 kinds of quiet, and this second kind, the kind that follows a confession instead of a threat, always sits differently in the chest. The fire had started small. Which is how they always start, whether it's a fire in a barn, or a fire in a woman's chest that eats her hollow, over 8 years. Small enough, at first, that a person tells themselves it's manageable. Small enough that a person believes they'll catch it, before it spreads, before it climbs past the height a bucket can reach, before it becomes the kind of thing no amount of hauling water is ever going to stop. Billy hadn't caught it. Nobody had. Because by the time anybody in that yard understood what was happening, the flames had already climbed higher than a person could reach, and the only thing left to do was stand there and watch 8 years of building come apart in under 20 minutes. She'd been 2 days out, selling horses at a settlement south along the river, because winter was coming on hard. That year in a ranch, with no cash reserve, doesn't survive a Wyoming winter no matter how good the grazing was that summer. It was practical work. Ordinary work. The kind of trip she'd made a dozen times, before without incident, without a second thought given to what might happen while she was gone, because nothing ever had. 2 days. That was all it took. She could still recite the arithmetic of it, if anybody asked, though nobody ever did, because nobody knew to ask. 41 hours away from the ranch. 6 riders arrived sometime after dark on the second night. And by the time Billy crested the last ridge on her way home, riding easy, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether Caleb had remembered to bring the Maras in, before the evening chill, whether he'd finally gotten around to mending that stretch of fence along the north pasture she'd been after him about for weeks. The sky over Sorrel Creek was the wrong color. Orange where it should have been the flat gray blue of early evening. And underneath that orange, a column of smoke standing, so straight and so tall it looked, for one disorienting second, like something a person could have built on purpose, some strange dark monument rising out of the land she'd called home for 2 decades. She'd kicked her horse into a run, before her mind had even finished putting the pieces together. Before the animal part of her, the part that had learned, over decades on the frontier, exactly what that color of sky meant, had bothered translating the sight into words a person could actually think. By the time she reached the yard, there was nothing left to save. Only smoke, thick and acrid, catching in her throat and behind her eyes. Only the particular stillness of a place that violence has already finished with, the kind of quiet that settles in after the screaming's done, and there's nobody left to scream, a silence so total it felt less like the absence of noise, and more like a presence all its own, pressing down over everything. She found Caleb near what had been the porch. 20 years old. 3 weeks from a wedding that would never happen now, to a woman named Louisa Hart, who was, at that exact moment, 40 miles away, and had no idea her entire future had just burned to the ground alongside her fiancé, sleeping soundly, or trying to, in a rented room, dreaming perhaps of a dress she hadn't finished sewing yet. Billy had held her son's body until well past midnight. Nobody came to pull her away, because there was nobody left in that yard to do the pulling. Just her, and the smoke thinning slow into the cold night air, and a silence so complete it felt like the whole world had agreed to stop making noise out of respect. The horses were gone, driven off or scattered by the fire. The house was gone. The barn was a smoking skeleton against the sky finally settling back into its proper dark. And her son, the boy she'd raised alone since he was 15, the boy who'd learned to shoot to protect the herd from wolves and had never once, not once, raised a hand toward another living soul out of anger, lay still in the ruined yard, while his mother sat with him and refused, for hours, to accept that refusing wouldn't change anything. In the wreckage, days later, once she'd found the strength to sift through what remained, she found one thing that hadn't burned all the way through. A wooden cradle. Half finished. Caleb had been building it in the tack shed at night, telling nobody, planning to surprise Louisa with it once they were married and settled, and maybe, in a year or 2, expecting. She could picture him at it now, working by lamplight, after a long day's chores, sanding the curve of a rocker smooth by hand, humming something tuneless the way he always did, when his hands were busy and his mind was somewhere pleasant. He never got the chance to give it to her. Never got the chance to know that Louisa was already 3 weeks pregnant the night the fire took him, carrying a child neither of them had any idea existed yet, a secret the universe had kept even from the 2 people it belonged to. Billy hadn't known that either. Not for years. Not until long after she'd already ridden out chasing the first of the 6 names, already buried her son on the rise overlooking the creek he'd died defending, already decided that the only thing left worth doing, with whatever life remained to her, was making sure every rider who'd touched a torch to that yard answered for it, one by one, however long it took. She could still see the cradle when she closed her eyes. Half-carved. One curved rocker finished smooth, the other still rough, where Caleb's tools had left it the last night he ever picked them up, the unfinished half somehow more painful to look at than the finished one, a visible record of a future interrupted mid-motion. She hadn't kept it. Couldn't bring herself to. She'd buried it near him instead, because it felt wrong, somehow, to carry a piece of a future that had burned before it ever got the chance to happen, a future that belonged in the ground alongside the boy who'd been building it. What she had kept, what she carried, 8 years later, folded flat in the bottom of her saddlebag, was a single charred fragment of the wood. small enough to fit in a closed fist. She touched it some nights, when the road got long, and the names got hard to keep chasing, just to remind herself what she was still doing out there, 3 territories from home, with a revolver she'd learned to use for reasons that had nothing to do with becoming the kind of woman men whispered about in saloons. She hadn't set out to become a gunslinger. Nobody ever does, really. Not the good ones, anyway. The ones who end up fast on the draw for the wrong reasons, men like Sloane, chasing the fear in other men's eyes, because it fills something hollow in their own chest. Those men choose it. Reach for it on purpose, the way a man reaches for a drink he knows is going to cost him something later, knowing the cost, and taking the drink anyway, because the wanting outweighs the knowing. Billy hadn't chosen it. It had been handed to her, the way a debt gets handed to a widow, who never signed for the loan. Her husband, Grady, had died of a fever 3 winters before the fire, leaving her alone on a ranch 2 days from the nearest town, with a 15-year-old son, and no one else to split the work with. She remembered the particular quality of that grief too, though it had softened, over the years, into something manageable, something she could hold, without it cutting her the way this newer grief still did. She'd learned to shoot, because wolves came down out of the hills some winters hungry enough to test a fence line, and because drifters passing through didn't always ask permission before helping themselves to whatever a woman alone might have worth taking. She'd gotten good at it. Not fast gun good. Just reliable good. The kind of good that keeps a ranch standing through a decade of hard winters and worse men, without ever once needing to prove itself in front of an audience, without ever once being tested by anything more dangerous than a hungry animal or an opportunistic thief. Until the night an audience of 6 proved it for her, whether she wanted the proving or not, and turned a widow's practical caution into something else entirely. Something with a purpose that would carry her, unrelenting, across 3 territories, and 8 long years. Back in the rusted spur, the silence had started to shift again. Because a crowd doesn't stay quiet forever. Not once it's decided there's more to hear. Curly-headed and thin at the shoulders, a miner near the door found his voice first. His name was Jed Calloway, though nobody in that room knew it yet, and he hadn't spoken a word since the whiskey first hit Billy's hat, standing at the edge of the crowd, with the particular stillness of a man working up his own courage in real time. That ain't the only account needs settling in this room tonight. Every head turned. Took near half my claim last spring. His voice gained steadiness, with every word, the way a man's voice does once he realizes somebody's finally listening, finally taking his complaint seriously instead of waving it off the way the camp always had before. Told me the paperwork read different than what I'd filed, with my own hand. Wasn't a court in this whole camp fit to argue it with him. He nodded toward Sloane. Didn't need to say the name. Another voice picked it up, before Calloway had even finished. A dealer, describing money skimmed off the top of every big pot at Sloane's table for 3 months running, under a threat nobody had dared refuse out loud, his voice shaking slightly even now, months of accumulated resentment finally finding an outlet. Then a third voice, quieter, from a man near the back, who described a gambler beaten half senseless in the alley behind the spur back in July, for the crime of winning too consistently at Sloane's own table, a story the whole camp had apparently known, and none of them had ever said aloud, until this exact moment gave them permission. Sloane sat frozen through all of it, watching 4 months of carefully built fear come apart, testimony by testimony, into something closer to an honest accounting than he'd ever expected to face in this particular room, on this particular night. None of that's got anything to do with some fire 8 years back. His voice had lost most of its fight. Just the thin last argument of a man who could feel the whole camp deciding something, without waiting on his permission to do it. Didn't need to. Boone said it plain. Reason this whole room's still standing here listening to you instead of going back to their cards is what you did to Jed, and half this camp since spring. That's the reason you're not walking back out that door tonight, with your guns loaded. Sloane looked toward Billy. Some last flicker of hope crossing his face. That the woman who just spared his life might speak up for him now. found nothing there, but the same steady, unreadable patience that had unsettled him, from the first minute he noticed her, sitting quiet in that corner with a coffee cup he hadn't thought twice about. "I'm not deciding anything for this camp." Billy said it even unhurried. "Never came here to. What happens to him past tonight belongs to you. Same as it would have before I ever rode in and sat down for a cup of coffee that's long gone cold by now." Boone looked around the room. At Calloway. At the dealer. At the man near the back who'd described the beating in the alley. At a dozen other faces who'd spent months quietly paying Sloane's particular tax on fear, without ever once naming it out loud in front of witnesses. And found, without much further discussion needed, the kind of quiet consensus a camp, without formal law, relies on to keep itself from tearing apart entirely. Sloane would be walked to the edge of Harlan's Notch by sundown tomorrow. Guns empty first. Reputation already dying faster than any horse could carry him away from it. But something in the way Sloane's shoulders had folded, something in the particular quality of the silence that followed his confession, told Billy this wasn't finished. Not the way the other 5 had been finished. Because with each of those 5, the story had ended clean. A name, a reckoning, a grave, a road out of town the next morning, with nothing left behind her, but dust settling slowly back down onto an empty street. This one had a loose thread hanging off it. And Billy Hargrove had spent 8 years learning never to walk away from a loose thread until she'd pulled it all the way through, no matter how much unraveling waited on the other end of the pulling. She found Sloane again near midnight. Alone, under guard outside the livery, waiting on whatever the camp had decided to do with him come morning. Boone stood a few paces off, arms crossed, giving them what privacy the circumstance allowed, his silhouette a patient, watchful shape against the lantern lights spilling out through the open door. Sloane looked up when she approached. Didn't flinch this time. Something had gone out of him that wasn't coming back, not tonight, maybe not ever. The particular kind of fear that keeps a bully standing tall had drained clean out of his face, replaced by something closer to exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who'd spent 4 months holding a mask in place, with both hands, and had finally been allowed to set it down. "You could have killed me." His voice had steadied some, though it still carried the rasp of a man who'd spent the last several hours coming apart in front of strangers. "Nobody in that room would have stopped you. Half of them wanted you to. Wasn't what I rode 8 years for." "Then what were you riding for?" She didn't answer right away. Let the question sit in the cold night air between them, because it was a fair question, and she'd asked it of herself more times than she cared to count, especially on the long stretches of road between one name and the next, staring up at unfamiliar stars and unfamiliar country, wondering what exactly she thought she was building toward. Wanted to know why. Finally. Wanted somebody left alive, who could tell me why 6 people rode out to a ranch that never did a single thing to any of you, and burned it to the ground, and didn't think twice about who might be inside. Sloane's jaw worked. Something crossing behind his eyes that looked almost like relief, the way a man looks when he's finally being asked the one question he's spent years dreading, and half hoping somebody would ask, the particular relief of a wound finally being examined, after too long left to fester in silence. "Wasn't our idea." He said it low. Quiet enough that Boone, a few paces off, wouldn't catch it. "The fire wasn't something the 6 of us cooked up on our own. We were 17, 19, 22. Boys, mostly. Somebody older put the idea in front of us, and put money behind it, and none of us asked enough questions before we said yes." Billy went very still. Because in 8 years, through 5 names, 5 confrontations, 5 confessions given in barns and back rooms, and once, memorably, on a river bank at dawn, not one of the other 5 had said anything close to this. Every one of them had told some version of the same story. A gang of 6, acting on their own cruelty, no larger hand guiding them, 6 young men who'd simply chosen to be monstrous, because the country was wide, and the law was absent, and nobody had ever stopped them. "Somebody paid you." Her voice had gone very flat. Very careful. To burn Sorrel Creek. Sloane nodded. Slow. Like the admission cost him something physical to give up, some last piece of himself finally handed over. Man never gave his name. Not to me, anyway. Older fella, maybe two of the others knew him better than I did. Paid good money. Said the land needed clearing before winter, said there was gold under it worth more than what was sitting on top. Something cold moved through Billy's chest. Colder than the whiskey that had soaked through her collar hours earlier. Colder than 8 years of grief had ever quite managed to make her feel, because grief, however heavy, at least had a shape she'd learned to carry, a familiar weight settled into familiar muscles. This didn't have a shape yet. Just an edge. Sharp enough to cut clean through everything she'd believed for 8 years about what had happened to her son, and why, and who was left standing, that still owed her an answer. You're telling me. Slow. Deliberate. Making sure she had every word of it exactly right. That my ranch didn't burn, because 6 drunk boys decided to be cruel one night. I'm telling you it burned, because somebody decided there was money under it. And found 6 people cheap enough, and stupid enough, and scared enough of saying no, to go do the burning for him. Billy stood there a long moment. The cold night air moving through the camp, carrying wood smoke and horse, and the particular metallic tang that clung to every gold camp she'd ever ridden through, the smell she'd come to associate, over 8 years, with grief that hadn't finished being paid for yet. Somewhere behind her, in the rusted spur, the noise of the evening had thinned down to almost nothing, the last stragglers finally giving up the story for the night, and heading home to beds that would, she suspected, still be turning the whole thing over come morning. 5 names. 8 years. She told herself, riding into Harlan's notch 3 days ago, that this was the last one. That whatever waited at the end of the 6th name would finally let her set the weight down, one way or another, and ride east toward whatever remained of a life she hadn't lived in a very long time. Except that wasn't true anymore. Because now there was a 7th name out there. A name nobody had ever spoken to her in 8 years of asking. A name that had apparently been standing behind all 6 of them the entire time, safe and unbothered, while she rode, from territory to territory hunting the people cheap enough to do his burning for him. Who? She said it quiet. Almost gentle. The way a person asks a question they're afraid of the answer to. Who paid you? Sloane looked away. Out toward the dark line of the ridge beyond the camp, where the last of the evening's light had already gone. Don't know his name for certain. A long pause. But I know where he lives now. Ain't far from here. Man's respected in this camp. Owns half the claims worth owning. He looked back at her. And for the first time, since she'd walked into that saloon, Billy Hargrove saw something in his face that wasn't fear, and wasn't defiance, and wasn't the particular hollow performance of a man who'd built his whole reputation on cruelty. It was something closer to guilt. Guilt that had been sitting in him for 8 years, with nowhere honest to go, until tonight, until a woman, with gray in her hair, and a dead son's cradle fragment folded into the bottom of her saddlebag had walked into his saloon, and taken it from him without ever once raising her voice. You want the truth. His voice cracked again, differently this time. Not from fear. From something closer to relief at finally saying it out loud, after 8 years of carrying it silent. I've spent every day, since that night, waiting on somebody to finally ask me the right question. You're the first one who ever did. Billy didn't answer right away. Because somewhere behind her ribs, the grief she'd carried 8 years, grief she'd built into something almost livable, something she'd learned to fold small enough to fit alongside everything else a person has to carry through a life, had just cracked open again. Wider than it had in years. Wide enough that she could feel, for the first time, since she'd buried her son on that rise above Sorrel Creek, that the story she told herself about what happened that night, and why, and who was responsible, had never been the whole story at all. Just the part 6 frightened boys had been paid to give her. Tomorrow. She said it finally. Low. Steady, though it cost her something to keep it that way. You're going to tell me everything you remember about this man. His face. His voice. Anything he said that night or after. And then this camp is going to decide what happens to you, same as they already decided. Sloane nodded. Something in his shoulders easing, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when a debt he's carried too long finally starts moving toward being paid, even if the pain costs him everything he has left. Billy turned and walked back toward the spur toward Bo, waiting patient at the rail, ears working the changed pitch of a camp that had gone quieter than it had any right to be for this hour of the night. She untied him. Rested a hand along his neck a moment, the way she had 100 nights on 100 roads just like this one, needing the warmth of something living and steady before she let herself think too hard about whatever came next. Because tonight had been supposed to be the last name. The final entry on a list she'd carried, so long the carrying had become its own kind of home, uncomfortable but familiar, the only shape her life had taken since the fire. And now there was a seventh name waiting somewhere out past the edge of camp. A man respected. A man who owned half the claims worth owning. A man who never once had to answer for anything, because he'd been smart enough, or cowardly enough, to make sure other people did the burning, while he stayed home counting what the land underneath was worth. She swung up into the saddle. Sat there a long moment under a sky gone fully dark now, stars scattered thick the way they only ever seemed to scatter out here, far from any town large enough to dim them, a whole cold ceiling of light indifferent to everything happening beneath it. 8 years, she thought. 8 years chasing 5 names, that were never the whole story. And somewhere close by, closer, she suspected, than she'd have guessed even an hour ago, the 6th name's confession had just handed her the beginning of a 7th. She didn't ride east that night. Didn't ride anywhere at all. Just sat there on Bo's back in the cold dark outside the rusted spur, one hand resting light against the saddlebag, where a small charred fragment of unfinished wood sat folded at the bottom, and let herself feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something that wasn't quite grief, and wasn't quite rage, but sat somewhere close to both of them. Because the list wasn't finished after all. It had just gotten one name longer. And this time, she intended to find out exactly whose name that was, however long the finding took, and whatever it cost her to get there. Morning in Harlan's notch came in gray first. Then gold, slow, the sun climbing up, over the ridge the way it always did, indifferent to whatever had happened in that saloon the night before, indifferent to the fact that an entire camp had spent its evening watching a reputation come apart at the seams. Billy hadn't slept. Not really. She'd sat through most of the dark hours on a bench outside the livery, wrapped in her duster, watching the guard shift change twice, while Wyatt Sloane sat inside, with his wrists bound loose to a support post, staring at nothing in particular. Because sleep wasn't coming. Because her mind had kept circling back to the same 6 words, over and over, until they'd worn a groove, into her like water wears a groove, into stone, the kind of groove that doesn't disappear again no matter how many seasons pass over it. Somebody paid you to burn Sorrel Creek. She'd said them once. Out loud. To make sure they were real, and not just something grief had finally invented for her, 8 years too late, some cruel trick her own mind had played on her, after a decade of carrying weight nobody else could see. They were real. And now morning had arrived, and with it, the obligation to do something about that reality instead of just sitting with it. She found Sloane awake, when she stepped inside the livery, the smell of hay and horse and old leather thick in the cool morning air. His eyes came up to hers immediately. No fear in them this time. Just the flat, hollowed-out look of a man who'd already surrendered the only thing he'd spent 4 months building. You look like you didn't sleep either. Didn't. Billy pulled a crate over. Sat across from him, close enough to keep her voice low. Told you last night? You're going to give me everything you remember. I know what I told you. Then start. He looked past her, toward the open livery doors, toward the strip of gold light already climbing the far wall, dust motes drifting slow through it like something suspended outside of time. His name's Pratt. A pause. Like the name cost him something to say out loud in daylight, in a way it hadn't cost him in the dark the night before. Augustus Pratt. Billy went still. Because she'd heard that name already. Not from Sloane. From the camp itself, in scattered pieces, over the last 3 days, mentioned in passing by a shopkeeper counting out change, referenced once by a miner complaining about claim boundaries, over a plate of beans, spoken with something close to reverence by a woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store, the particular tone people use for a man they consider a benefactor rather than merely a neighbor. Augustus Pratt owned the biggest stake in Harlan's Notch. Owned 3 others besides. Had put up the money for the schoolhouse, that hadn't been built yet, promised funds for a proper church come spring, sat at the head of every informal meeting the camp ever held about its own future. Augustus Pratt was, by every account she'd gathered, without even trying, the most respected man in the entire territory around Harlan's Notch. You're telling me. Slow. Careful. Making absolutely sure. That the man funding half this camp's future is the same man who paid for my son's murder. I'm telling you what I know. Sloane's jaw tightened. Wasn't there when the money changed hands? Wasn't old enough, wasn't trusted enough back then. But I heard the name spoken twice that week. Once before. Once after. And the man who spoke it both times was scared to say it, which told me plenty on its own. Scared of what? Of the same thing everybody in this camp's scared of, whether they admit it out loud or not. He met her eyes. Pratt doesn't burn things himself. Never has. Just finds people cheap enough, or desperate enough to do it for him. And once it's done, he's 3 steps removed, and clean as a Sunday collar, while whoever pulled the trigger, or lit the match, carries the whole weight alone. Billy sat with that. Let it settle down, into the same place, where she'd been carrying 8 years of grief, except now the grief had a new shape pressing up against it. Something sharper. Something with edges that didn't dull no matter how many times she turned it over in her mind. Because for 8 years she believed the story was simple. 6 cruel men. 6 names. 6 reckonings, one at a time, until the debt came even, a clean accounting she could point to, and call finished. Except it was never simple. It had never once been simple. Which meant every reckoning she delivered, 5 of them, 5 graves scattered across 3 territories, had only ever settled a fraction of what was actually owed. Why now? She said it quiet. Almost to herself. 8 years, and nobody said his name to me, before this morning. Because everybody who might have said it is either dead, or too scared to. Sloane's voice had gone rough. You want the truth, I wasn't planning on saying it either. Wasn't planning on saying anything last night. Would have kept it buried the rest of my life, if you hadn't walked into that room, and looked at me the way you did. How'd I look at you? Like you already knew everything, and were just waiting on me to catch up. Billy almost smiled. Almost. The expression didn't quite make it all the way to her face, because there wasn't much room left in her chest, that morning for anything close to warmth. Sundown tonight. She stood. Brushed dust off her knees out of old habit rather than any real need. Camp's walking you out. That's decided. Not something I can change even, if I wanted to. Wasn't asking you to change it. I know. A pause. But before they walk you out, you're going to sit with me 1 more hour. And you're going to tell me every single thing you remember about that man. What he looks like. How he talks. Where he goes, who he trusts, what he's scared of. Because I've spent 8 years hunting men, who are easy to find, and easier to prove guilty. This one's going to be either. Sloane nodded. Slow. Then we'd best get started. The expulsion happened at sundown, exactly as the camp had decided the night before. 4 men walked Sloane to the edge of Harlan's Notch, as the light went long and gold across the main road, casting everybody's shadow far longer than they'd stand in life, his horse saddled by somebody else's hands, his revolvers returned only, after being thoroughly emptied. A crowd gathered loose along the boardwalks to watch, The way crowds always gather for an ending, even an ending nobody in, that crowd had a personal stake in. Billy stood apart from it. Watched from the edge of the livery, arms crossed, bow's reins loose in one hand, the horse patient beside her the way he always was, having long since learned to wait, through whatever his rider needed to work through. Sloane paused before he mounted. Looked back once, found her across the distance, and something passed between them that didn't need words. An understanding, maybe? Or just the particular recognition two people share, when they'd both spent years carrying weight they didn't ask for, and finally set some small piece of it down in the same room. "Where will you go?" Boone asked it, standing near the horse, arms crossed over his chest. "Don't know yet." Sloane swung up into the saddle. "Never had much practice figuring out who I am, without a reputation attached. Might be a good time to start." Sloane looked toward Billy one last time. "You find him." He said it loud enough that only she and Boone caught it clearly. "You find Pratt, and you make him answer for what 6 scared kids ended up carrying alone. That's the only thing that'll make any of this mean something." Then he turned the horse east, and rode out past the last of the tents, and the last of the sluice boxes, and Harlan's Notch watched him go the way a town watches any legend die, quietly, and a little uncertainly, unsure yet what shape the story would take once enough retellings had smoothed the rougher edges off the truth. Billy watched until he'd crested the far rise, and disappeared from sight, dust settling slow behind him in the long evening light. Then she turned back toward camp. Toward the work that actually mattered now. Because the 6th name was gone, riding east with nothing but a horse, and whatever redemption he could scrape together for himself. The 7th name was still standing somewhere close by, respected and untouched, and Billy Hargrove had no intention of letting that particular arithmetic stand for very much longer. She spent the next 3 days learning the shape of Augustus Pratt the way she'd learned the shape of every name before him. Quietly. Patiently. Asking questions that didn't sound like questions, listening more than she spoke, letting the camp tell her its own story about the man, without ever once revealing why she wanted to hear it. She spent an afternoon at the general store, buying supplies she didn't strictly need, letting the shopkeeper's wife talk her ear off about how kind Mr. Pratt had been the previous winter, extending credit to families who'd have otherwise gone hungry before the spring thaw. She spent another morning near the half-built schoolhouse frame, listening to 2 carpenters discuss the quality of the lumber Pratt had donated, lumber that had come, apparently, all the way from a mill 2 territories over, at an expense neither carpenter could quite fathom a man choosing to bear out of pure generosity. What she learned troubled her more than any of it should have surprised her. Pratt was, by every outward account, exactly what Sloane had described. Wealthy. Generous with that wealth, at least publicly, funding the promised schoolhouse, subsidizing supply wagons for miners running short before payday, hosting a modest Sunday gathering at his home that had, in the absence of an actual church, become something close to a town meeting, a place where disputes got settled, and plans got made under his watchful, benevolent eye. He was, in short, precisely the kind of man a camp, without law naturally elevates. Because a place, with no court, and no badge needs somebody to trust, needs somebody whose word carries weight simply, because there's nothing else around sturdy enough to lean on. And Augustus Pratt had built himself into that role, with the same patience, the same careful attention to appearances, that Sloane had once used to build himself into a different kind of feared. Except where Sloane's power ran loud, whiskey glasses and threats spoken across crowded rooms, Pratt's ran quiet. Which made it harder to see. And a great deal harder to prove. She found his house on the 3rd day. Set apart from the rest of camp, up a low rise, with a proper fence around it, and glass windows shipped in at what must have been considerable expense. The kind of house, that told everyone, who saw it exactly what kind of future its owner expected Harlan's Notch to have, and exactly how much of that future he intended to own. She didn't approach. Not yet. Just sat on a low outcrop of rock a quarter-mile off, bow grazing easy nearby, and watched the house for the better part of an afternoon, the sun crawling slow across the sky above her, while she waited, patient in the particular way that 8 years of practice had taught her to be. Watched a man in a well-cut coat step out onto the porch once, around midday, to speak with 2 riders who'd come up from the direction of the eastern claims. Watched the exchange last only a few minutes, short, businesslike, no handshake at the end of it, which struck her as odd for a man whose whole public reputation rested on warmth and generosity. Watched the 2 riders leave the same direction they'd come, unhurried, in no particular rush, the way men move when they're confident nobody's going to question where they'd been or what they were doing there. She didn't know their faces, didn't know their names, but something about the exchange sat wrong in her chest. Small. Easy to dismiss, if she'd wanted to dismiss it. She didn't want to dismiss it. The letter arrived on the 4th day. Carried by a freight rider passing through on his way north, a man who'd apparently been asking after her by description in 3 separate camps, before somebody finally pointed him toward Harlan's notch. He found her outside the boarding house, where she'd taken a room, handed over a folded paper gone soft at the creases from weeks of travel, and rode on, without waiting for a reply, the way riders paid for delivery alone usually did. Billy unfolded it standing right there on the porch steps, the paper crackling faintly in the dry afternoon air. The handwriting was cramped, unpracticed. From a man named Thaddeus Reyes, a name she recognized, after a moment's searching, through 8 years of memory, a lawman, semi-retired, who'd helped her track down the 4th name on her list, 3 years back, outside a railhead settlement in Nebraska. She read it once. Then again slower, because the first reading hadn't fully landed. Mrs. Hargrove, writing on account of something's been sitting wrong with me since our business together 3 years past. The man you found outside the railhead, the one you called the 4th name, I've had cause since to speak with 2 others who knew him before that summer. Both told a story that don't sit easy alongside what we believed at the time. Seems he wasn't at Sorrel Creek by choice. Seems there's a version where he tried to talk the others out of it that night and got beaten near senseless for the trying, and only rode with them after because a man with 2 broken ribs don't have much choice left in the matter. I don't say this to trouble you further than you're already troubled. I say it because a person deserves the truth told plain, even 3 years too late to change anything. Whatever you decide to do with it is yours to decide. T. Reyes. Billy stood there a long time, the paper trembling just slightly in her hand. Because if this was true, because if even one word of it was true, then 3 years ago, outside a railhead in Nebraska, she had killed a man who'd tried to stop the fire that took her son. A man who'd been beaten for trying. A man who'd ridden, with 5 others not out of cruelty, but out of a broken body, and no remaining choice. She sat down on the porch steps. Hard. The letter still gripped tight enough that her knuckles had gone pale around it, the wood of the step cool and rough beneath her. 8 years, she thought. Except thinking it in words felt too orderly for what was actually happening in her chest, which was less a thought, and more a kind of collapse, slow and internal, the floor of something she'd built her whole self around for 8 years quietly giving way beneath her. Because she told herself, every single time, that she was certain that the reckoning she delivered was clean, was earned, was the one thing in an unjust world that could still be counted as justice rightly done. Which meant if she'd been wrong even once. Which meant if the 4th name had died for something closer to a boy dragged into a horror he tried to prevent. Then what, exactly, had the last 8 years actually been? She sat with the question a long while. Didn't have an answer. Wasn't sure there was an answer that wouldn't cost her something essential to hear it spoken. She found Boone that evening, sitting alone outside the freight office he ran near the center of camp, boots up on a barrel, whittling at a piece of scrap wood, with no particular shape in mind, the way men do when their hands need something to occupy them, while their mind works somewhere else entirely. Got a question. She sat down across from him without waiting for an invitation. Figured you might? Augustus Pratt. Something crossed Boone's face. Quick. Gone almost before she caught it. But she'd spent 8 years learning to read exactly that kind of quick, vanishing expression, and she caught it anyway. What about him? You've known him a while. Everybody in this camp's known him a while. Man's been here longer than most of us. Boone's knife kept moving, slow and even, against the wood. Why the interest? Because I think he's the reason my son is dead. The knife stopped. For a long moment, Boone didn't say anything at all. Just sat there, the half-carved piece of wood balanced across one knee, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, out toward the darkening line of the ridge. That's a serious thing to say about a man like Pratt. It's a serious thing to have happened to a person's family. Her voice stayed even. Flat. Sloane told me before he rode out. Told me Pratt paid for 6 people to burn a ranch that never did anything to any of them. My ranch. My son. Boone set the knife down slow. Set the wood down beside it. You believe him? I believe a scared man telling the truth for the first time in 8 years sounds different than a scared man telling a lie. She leaned forward slightly. And I think you already knew some version of this, before I ever said his name out loud just now. The silence that followed went on long enough, that Billy understood, before he ever spoke another word, that she'd guessed correctly. Camp like this. Boone finally said it, low, not quite meeting her eyes. Runs on money that's got no law watching, where it comes from or where it goes. Pratt's money built half of what's standing here. School that ain't built yet, but the lumber's already paid for. Supply line that's kept half this camp from starving through 2 hard winters. You start pulling at a man like that, whole camp comes apart with him. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got. Then let me ask it plainer. Billy's voice had dropped, gone quiet in the particular way that made people lean in rather than pull back. Have you known, this whole time, what kind of money actually funds this camp's future? Have you known, and chosen to look past it, because looking past it kept things running smooth? Boone's jaw tightened. I've known enough to have my suspicions. Never had proof. Never wanted proof, if I'm being honest with you, because proof would have meant doing something about it, and doing something about it would have meant tearing apart the only stable thing this camp's had, since it started. So you protected him. I protected the camp. His voice rose, just slightly, defensive now in a way it hadn't been a moment before. There's a difference. Is there? Billy held his gaze. Because from where I'm sitting, those 2 things look exactly the same. And they cost my son his life. Boone looked away first. Out toward the ridge, toward the dark coming down slow, over Harlan's Notch, the same dark that had come down, over Sorrel Creek 8 years back, the same color it always was, indifferent to what it covered. I didn't know it was your family. He said it quiet, almost pleading. I want you to understand that much. I didn't know the burning had a name, and a face attached, until you sat down here 2 minutes ago, and gave me both. Would it have mattered? The question sat between them a long time, before Boone finally answered it. I'd like to think it would have. But you're not certain. No. He looked back at her, and for the first time, since she'd known him, 3 short days, though it felt considerably longer now, she saw something close to shame settle into his face. I'm not certain of much of anything right now. That night, Billy sat alone outside the boarding house, with the fragment of charred wood from Caleb's cradle turned slow between her fingers, the way she did on the nights when the weight got too heavy to carry sitting still, the rough charred edge familiar against her fingertips, worn smoother with every year of handling. Because everything she'd believed for 8 years had just come apart in the space of 4 days. The 4th name, possibly innocent, possibly a boy who'd tried to stop the very thing she'd killed him for. The 6th name, guilty, but not the architect, just another frightened boy following money he hadn't been strong enough to refuse. And now a 7th name, hiding behind wealth, and warmth and a well-cut coat, who had never once had to answer for anything, because he'd been careful enough, or cowardly enough, to keep his own hands entirely clean. She thought about riding out that night. About leaving Harlan's Notch behind the way she'd left every other camp before it, chasing whatever came next, without waiting around to see how the story finished. Except she couldn't. Not this time. Because this time the story wasn't finished, and worse, this time she wasn't entirely certain the story she'd been telling herself for 8 years had ever been true in the first place. Which meant she owed somebody an accounting. Owed the fourth name's memory an accounting, even if there was no way now to give it. Owed her own son an accounting, though she suspected that particular debt could never truly be settled, not by any means available to a woman, with a revolver, and 8 years of grief dressed up as purpose. And owed Augustus Pratt an accounting most of all. Because whatever else had gone wrong along the way, whatever mistakes she made chasing names, that turned out more complicated than the rumors that led her to them, the man behind all 6 riders, that night was still out there, sleeping easy in a house, with glass windows, funding a schoolhouse he never once had to justify, with anything close to the truth. She closed her fist around the wood fragment. Felt the rough, charred edge of it press into her palm the way it had 100 nights before. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would find a way to get close to Augustus Pratt. Close enough to see past the well-cut coat, and the warm public smile to whatever sat underneath it. Close enough to start building, piece by careful piece, whatever it was going to take to make a respected man answer for a crime nobody in Harlan's Notch had ever once thought to lay at his door. The opportunity came 2 days later, in the form of an invitation she hadn't sought, and almost didn't accept. Word had traveled through camp, the way word always traveled in a place, with no newspaper, and no official channel, just mouths and ears, and the particular hunger small towns have for anything resembling a story, about the woman who'd walked into the rusted spur, and taken down Wyatt Sloane, without firing a single shot. The story had grown some in the telling, the way stories always do, gathering embellishments the way a river gathers silt on its way downstream. By the time it reached Augustus Pratt's ears, it had apparently grown interesting enough that he sent a boy up to the boarding house, with a handwritten note. Mrs. Hargrove, I understand you're the woman responsible for resolving our recent difficulty with Mr. Sloane. I'd be grateful for the chance to thank you properly, and to hear the account, from your own telling rather than the camp's considerably exaggerated version. Would you do me the honor of joining me for supper this evening? A. Pratt. Billy read it twice. Felt something cold settle low in her stomach, the particular chill that comes from being invited, politely and without any apparent suspicion, into the company of the very person she'd spent days quietly investigating. She almost declined. Except declining would have told him something. Would have suggested she had a reason to avoid him, and reasons like that had a way of surfacing eventually, in a camp this size, where nothing stayed buried for long. So she wrote back a short acceptance. Handed it to the same boy who delivered the original note. And spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing herself the way she'd prepared herself, before every one of the previous 6 confrontations, not with weapons this time, but with the particular kind of stillness a person needs to sit across a table, from a man she believed had ordered her son's murder, and give nothing of that belief away in her face. Pratt's house looked larger up close than it had, from the outcrop, where she'd watched it days before. 2 stories, unusual for a camp this young, with a wrap-round porch, and those glass windows catching the last orange light of evening like something deliberately staged for effect, an architecture built not just for shelter, but for a very specific kind of performance. A housekeeper let her in. Led her through a front room furnished, with pieces that had clearly traveled a long way to end up in a Wyoming gold camp, a proper dining table, chairs with upholstered seats, a sideboard holding china that looked entirely out of place next to the raw lumber, and canvas that made up most of Harlan's Notch, everything chosen, it seemed to Billy, with the deliberate intention of communicating exactly how far above the ordinary camp its owner considered himself to stand. Augustus Pratt stood when she entered. He was younger than she'd expected. Somewhere in his 50s, she guessed, though carrying it well, silver at the temples, a neatly trimmed beard, the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of never once having to worry where his next meal or his next dollar was coming from. His coat was the same well-cut garment she'd seen from a distance, and up close it looked even more deliberately chosen, tailored in a way that no honest tailor in a camp like Harlan's Notch could possibly have managed. Mrs. Hargrove. His voice was warm. Practiced warm, the kind that comes from years of using charm, as a tool rather than an accident of temperament. I've heard nothing but remarkable things. Wasn't much remarkable about it. She let him gesture her toward a chair. Saturday. Kept her hands folded in her lap, still, the way she'd learned to keep them still in 100 rooms just like this one. Man had a reputation built on other people's fear. Once somebody stopped being afraid, the whole thing came apart on its own. Modesty. Pratt smiled, settling into the chair across from her. I understand modesty is fashionable among certain kinds of frontier heroes. Though I confess I find it a bit disappointing. I was hoping for a proper story. Sorry to disappoint. Not at all disappointed. His eyes stayed on her, steady, assessing in a way that felt entirely at odds with the warmth in his voice. Merely curious. A woman doesn't simply happen into a skill like the one you demonstrated at the Rusted Spur. There's a history behind hands that's steady, I'd imagine. Billy held his gaze without blinking. Everybody's got a history, Mr. Pratt. Indeed they do. He poured wine into a glass she hadn't asked for, set it near her hand without comment. Though some histories are more interesting than others. I find myself wondering what brought you to Harlan's Notch specifically. This isn't, if you'll forgive my saying so, the sort of camp that typically attracts a woman traveling alone. Was passing through. Passing through toward where? The question landed, with a little too much precision. A little too carefully placed, the way a fisherman places a lure exactly, where he expects the fish to be waiting, rather than casting blind and hoping. Billy felt something tighten in her chest. East, mostly? She kept her voice easy. Unbothered. Wherever the road happens to lead next. How wonderfully unstructured. Pratt smiled again, though something behind it had shifted, just slightly, in a way she couldn't quite name, but felt clearly enough. I do admire a person unburdened by obligation. Most of us carry considerably more weight than that. Some weight's harder to set down than others. Isn't that the truth? He raised his glass, though he didn't drink from it right away, just held it, turning it slow between his fingers the way a man turns over a thought he isn't quite ready to voice. I lost a great deal, myself, some years back. Before Harlan's Notch. Before any of this. A small gesture, taking in the room, the house, the whole camp beyond it. One learns, eventually, that grief either builds something, or destroys it. I chose to build. Billy sat very still. Because there was something underneath those words. Something deliberate. As though he were speaking directly to her, in a language only the two of them understood, testing to see whether she'd flinch at the shape of it. She didn't flinch. Building's a fine choice. Her voice stayed level. Long as what gets built doesn't come at somebody else's expense. For the briefest moment, so brief she almost doubted she'd seen it at all, something cold passed behind Pratt's eyes. Gone before it had fully arrived, replaced immediately by the same practiced warmth he'd worn since she'd walked through the door. Wise words, Mrs. Hargrove. He finally drank from the glass. Wise words indeed. The rest of supper passed in careful, circling conversation, Pratt asking questions that sounded casual, and landed with far too much precision, Billy answering in half-truths general enough to reveal nothing, while still sounding like an honest woman, with nothing to hide. He asked about her travels, and she gave him fragments of true things arranged to suggest a life simpler than the one she'd actually lived. He asked whether she had family waiting anywhere, and she felt the question land somewhere it had no business landing, felt her own pulse quicken in a way she worked hard not to let show in her hands, or her voice. By the time she rose to leave, the sun had gone down fully outside the glass windows, and something in her chest had settled into a certainty she hadn't quite possessed walking in. Because Augustus Pratt knew something. Not everything. She was fairly certain of that much. But something. Enough that his questions hadn't felt idle. Enough that his mention of grief, and building, and weight that's hard to set down, had felt less like small talk, and more like a man testing the edges of a story he already half suspected. Which meant, whatever careful investigation she'd hoped to conduct quietly, from a comfortable distance, was no longer entirely quiet. Pratt walked her to the door himself. Stood in the frame a moment, as she stepped out, onto the porch, the evening air cool, after the close warmth of the dining room. "I do hope we'll speak again, Mrs. Hargrove." "Expect we will." She met his eyes one last time. Camp this size, folks tend to keep running into each other. How true. His smile didn't waver. But his voice, when he spoke again, had dropped just slightly, quiet enough that only she would catch the particular weight underneath it. "Do be careful on the road home. I understand this territory can be considerably less forgiving than it appears in daylight." Billy held very still. Because that wasn't an idle courtesy. She'd heard men deliver threats dressed up, as concerned before, had delivered a few herself, in circumstances that called for it, and she recognized the particular cadence of it immediately, the way a threat sits differently in a sentence than an actual pleasantry, no matter how carefully the words are chosen to disguise it. "Appreciate the concern." She held his gaze a beat longer than necessary. "I've made it home, through worse territory than this one." "I don't doubt it." He inclined his head, just slightly. "Good night, Mrs. Hargrove." She walked back down the rise toward camp, with her hand resting light against her hip, close to the revolver she hadn't needed to draw all evening, every sense in her body alert to the darkness pressing in on either side of the path, the crunch of gravel under her boots the only sound besides the distant, indifferent noise of the camp settling into its evening rhythm below. Because if Pratt suspected who she was, because if he'd already connected the woman who disarmed Sloane to the woman whose son had died in a fire 8 years and 3 territories away, then whatever quiet investigation she'd planned had just become considerably more dangerous. Not just for her. For anybody connected to her. Anybody Pratt could reach, if he decided reaching them was the fastest way to make an inconvenient problem disappear. And there was exactly one person left in this world connected to her by blood that Billy hadn't thought about in longer than she cared to admit, not because she'd forgotten, but because thinking about it too directly had always felt like more weight than she could carry alongside everything else. Louisa Hart. The woman Caleb had been 3 weeks from marrying the night the fire took him. Living somewhere north, last Billy had heard, in a settlement close enough to send money to, but far enough that Billy had never once found the courage to visit in person. And a daughter. Born a little over 8 months after the fire, though Billy hadn't learned that part until nearly 2 years after the fact, in a letter from Louisa that had taken her 3 attempts to finish reading through the first time, her hands shaking too badly on the first 2 tries to hold the paper steady. A little girl. 8 years old now. Named Josie. A granddaughter Billy Hargrove had never once laid eyes on, because facing that particular reunion had always felt like facing the fire all over again, except this time, with a child's face attached to everything she'd lost. She stopped walking. Stood there in the dark path between Pratt's house and the lights of camp, breath suddenly caught somewhere high in her chest, the cold night air sharp in her lungs. Because if Pratt was the kind of man who dressed threats up as pleasantries, because if he'd already started wondering who exactly this quiet woman from the rusted spur really was, and what exactly she wanted with Harlan's notch, then it was only a matter of time before that wondering turned into digging. And digging, eventually, into finding. And if he found Louisa, if he found Josie. Billy's hand tightened hard around the revolver grip at her hip, though there was nothing in the darkness around her to draw against, nothing except the sudden, sick understanding that 8 years of careful vengeance had just put people she loved directly into the path of a man dangerous enough to have ordered a fire, without ever once lighting the match himself. She started walking again. Faster now, boots striking harder against the packed earth of the path. Because there was work to do before morning. A letter, if nothing else, a warning, however late, however inadequate, to a woman, and a child she'd never once had the courage to meet face to face. And underneath that urgency, quieter, harder to look at directly, sat a thought Billy hadn't let herself think in 8 full years. That maybe this was never only about the 6 names on her list. That maybe, somewhere along the road, it had also become about the 2 people still living, who carried Caleb's blood forward, into the world, whether Billy had ever found the courage to know them or not. She reached the edge of camp, as the last light fully drained out of the sky. Looked back once, toward the rise, where Pratt's house sat lit warm, and welcoming against the dark, the glass windows catching lamplight the way they'd caught the sunset hours earlier, a beautiful thing built on a foundation Billy now understood to be soaked entirely, through with someone else's blood. A respected man. A generous man. A man the whole camp trusted without question. And somewhere underneath all of it, she was now certain, the same cold calculation that had once decided a horse ranch wasn't worth as much standing as it was worth burned to the ground and mined clean. She stood a moment longer at the boarding house door before going in, one hand resting on the frame, her chest tight, with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief, but had the particular gravity of both combined, a feeling she recognized from exactly one other night in her life, a night that had ended with a burned yard and a son she couldn't save. She would not let it end that way again. Whatever it cost her to make certain of that. Sleep never came that night. Not properly. Billy lay on top of the boarding house bed fully dressed, boots still on, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see in the dark, running the evening's conversation, with Pratt back, through her mind again, and again, searching every remembered word for the exact moment the danger had crystallized, from possibility into certainty. By the time the first gray light started climbing the window, she'd made her decision. She rose, lit a single candle, and sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the room, a sheet of paper in front of her, a pen that felt clumsy, and inadequate for the size of what needed saying. She tried once. The words came out wrong, too urgent, reading like panic on the page. Crumpled it, tossed it toward the cold hearth. Tried again. Too calm this time, too composed, failing to carry the weight the situation actually demanded. Crumpled that one too. On the 3rd attempt, she stopped trying to explain, and simply wrote what mattered most. Louisa. I know it's been too long, and I know I've given you every reason to stop expecting to hear from me at all. I'm not writing today to make excuses for that. I'm writing because there's a man in this camp who may already know who you are and who you were to Caleb, and I need you to take Josie somewhere safe until I can tell you why in person. Please trust that I wouldn't ask this if it weren't the most important thing I've ever asked of you. I am coming, as soon as I possibly can. Billy. She folded it, set it aside, and was reaching for her coat when a knock came at the door. Boone stood on the other side, hat in his hands, turning it slow between his fingers, the particular posture of a man who'd come to say something he wasn't proud of needing to say. Figured you'd still be awake. Wasn't much choice in the matter. He stepped inside, when she waved him in, closed the door behind him, stood near it rather than taking the single chair she gestured toward. I've been sitting with what you told me. His voice had none of its usual easy cadence. Sitting with it most of the night, if I'm honest. And I've decided I owe you more than what I gave you before. Meaning I know a few things about Pratt's business I never told anybody. Never told anybody, because knowing them, and saying them out loud felt like 2 very different kinds of trouble. He met her eyes. There's a ledger. Kept separate from the books he shows the camp. I've seen it once, by accident, years back, when I was hauling freight up to his house, and he stepped out to handle something, before he'd finished putting it away. Billy went very still. What was in it? Numbers that didn't match anything he ever told the camp about, where his money came from. Payments. Dates. Names I didn't recognize at the time, because I had no reason yet to be looking for them. Boone's jaw tightened. I think if you found that ledger again, you'd find your 6 names in it. Maybe more than 6. Where's it kept? Locked in his study. Behind the house, off the main hall. I've been in that room exactly once in 4 years, and I wasn't invited the second time I might have needed to be. Billy stood. Crossed to the window, looked out at the gray light climbing slow over the ridge, the camp beginning to stir below, smoke rising from cook fires, the first miners heading out toward the creek beds, with picks over their shoulders, all of it moving, with the ordinary rhythm of a place that had no idea yet what was sitting quiet at its center. I need that ledger. Figured you might say that. And I need Wyatt Sloane. Boone frowned. Man rode out east 3 days back. Then somebody needs to ride after him. Billy turned from the window. Because a ledger full of numbers proves money moved. Doesn't prove why, doesn't prove who ordered what done with it. Sloane's the only living person who can stand in front of this camp and connect Pratt's name to what happened at Sorrel Creek in his own words, out loud, where everybody can hear it. You think he'll come back? I think a man who spent 8 years drowning in guilt he never got to properly confess might jump at the chance to finish confessing it. She reached for her coat again. But that's a guess. And guesses aren't worth much against a man like Pratt. Boone was quiet a moment. I'll go. Finally. I know these roads better than most. Might catch him, before he's gone too far to turn back easy. Why? The question caught him off guard. He blinked, some of the resolve slipping for just a second. Why what? Why help now? 2 days ago you told me you protected the camp by looking past what Pratt might be. What changed? Boone was quiet a long moment, turning his hat over once more in his hands. Because I keep thinking about your boy. His voice had gone rough. 20 years old. 3 weeks from a wedding. And I've spent 4 years drinking coffee on Pratt's porch, taking his coin for freight work, telling myself the whole time that not asking questions was the same thing as not being involved. He looked up at her. It isn't. I understand that now. Might have taken me longer than it should have, but I understand it. Billy held his gaze a moment. Nodded once slow. Then ride fast. And Boone. He paused at the door. Thank you? He didn't answer that. Just settled his hat back onto his head and disappeared down the stairs, boots loud on the old wood, already moving toward the livery, before the door had fully swung shut behind him. Billy stood alone in the small room a moment longer, the letter to Louisa still folded in her hand, the candle guttering low on the desk. Then she went to find a rider willing to carry it north, because whatever else came next, Josie and Louisa needed warning first. Before the ledger, before Sloane, before whatever confrontation was coming for Augustus Pratt. She found a boy near the livery willing to ride for $1, and the promise of 2 more on delivery, young, maybe 16, with a fast horse, and the particular hunger for adventure that made frontier boys volunteer for things older men had learned to think twice about. Miller's Crossing. She pressed the letter into his hand, along with the first $1. Woman named Louisa Hart. Don't hand this to anybody else. Not the postmaster, not a neighbor, not anybody claiming they'll pass it along. Her hands only. Yes, ma'am. How fast can you make it? Roads decent this time of year. Could be there by tomorrow evening, riding hard. Tomorrow evening. Billy did the arithmetic in her head, the same arithmetic she'd done 8 years back riding home from selling horses, except this time the numbers felt different. Sharper. Because this time she had a chance to beat the fire, before it started, instead of arriving, after to find only smoke. Ride hard then. She pressed the boy's hand around the coin. And there's $5 more in it, if you make it by nightfall instead. The boy's eyes went wide. He was in the saddle, and moving before she'd finished the sentence, kicking his horse into a run that scattered chickens, and startled a mule team near the general store, and Billy stood watching him go, until he disappeared around the bend in the road, dust rising thin behind him in the pale morning light. She hoped it would be enough. What she didn't know, standing there in the road watching dust settle, was that the danger had already started moving north hours before her letter ever left Harlan's notch. Because the previous evening, the moment Billy walked away from his porch and disappeared down the dark rise toward camp, Augustus Pratt had stood in his doorway a long while, turning her careful non-answers over in his mind the way a man turns over a coin looking for the counterfeit stamp he suspects is hiding somewhere on its face. Her calm had been too calm. Her vagueness too practiced. A woman traveling east, mostly, wherever the road happens to lead next, was not a woman who had disarmed a dangerous man in under 3 seconds, without ever once needing to draw her own weapon. He had gone inside, that same night, before the candle in her own window had even been lit, and written 2 brief letters of his own. Had roused a pair of riders who'd visited his porch 2 days earlier, the same men who'd left in no particular hurry that afternoon, and given them new instructions delivered with considerably more urgency than the calm supper conversation upstairs would ever have suggested. Find out everything you can about a woman named Hargrove. Widow, gray-haired, rides a sorrel-and white horse. Family, if she has any. Start north. I have a feeling that's where the answer's waiting. The riders had left, before dawn, hours ahead of Billy's own messenger, carrying nothing but a description, and a name, and the particular unhurried confidence of men who'd been paid enough, over enough years, to never once question the errands they were sent on. Louisa Hart was 31 years old, though grief and 8 years of raising a daughter alone had put a few extra lines around her eyes that hadn't belonged there at 23, the year everything changed. She kept a small cabin at the edge of Miller's Crossing, close enough to the general store that she could walk to work each morning, with Josie in tow, far enough from the center of town that the evenings stayed quiet, which was, most nights, exactly how she preferred them. Josie was building something, with river stones on the cabin floor, when the knock came at the door. 8 years old, dark-haired like her father had been, with a habit of narrating everything she built out loud in a running commentary that Louisa had long since learned to love rather than tune out. This one's the barn. Josie set a flat stone carefully atop 2 others. And this one's the fence, except the fence keeps falling down, because the ground's not level, which isn't fair because... The knock came again. Harder this time. Louisa crossed to the door, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, expecting perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a delivery, from the store she'd forgotten to collect that afternoon. 2 men stood on the other side. Strangers. Well dressed in a way that didn't quite match the dust on their boots, the particular mismatch of men trying to look respectable, while having ridden hard to get somewhere. Louisa Hart. Not a question. A confirmation. Something cold moved through her chest immediately, the particular instinct a mother develops, without ever needing to be taught it, the one that recognizes danger, before the mind has finished cataloging why. Who's asking? We work for a man interested in speaking with you. The taller of the 2 smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Won't take but a few minutes of your time. I'm not interested in speaking with anybody I don't know, at my own door, this late in the evening. Behind her, Josie had gone quiet. Stone still, sensing something in her mother's voice that hadn't been there a moment before. We'd really rather you came willingly. The man's smile didn't waver, but something underneath it had gone harder. Makes things considerably easier for everybody involved. Especially the little one. Louisa's hand went instinctively behind her, reaching back toward Josie, without breaking eye contact with the man in the doorway. You're not taking my daughter anywhere. Nobody said anything about taking. The second man spoke for the first time, his voice quieter, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. Just an invitation. Your business, connected to a woman named Hargrove, we understand. Mr. Pratt would very much like to discuss the nature of that connection with you personally. The name landed in Louisa's chest like a dropped stone. Because she hadn't heard Billy Hargrove's name spoken by a stranger in years. Hadn't expected to hear it spoken by 2 men she'd never met, standing at her own door, using it the way a person uses a key, deliberately, to open something that had been closed a long time. I don't know anybody by that name. Course you don't? The taller man's patience had started fraying visibly now. We'll make this simple, Mrs. Hart. You and the girl are coming with us tonight. Nobody's getting hurt, long as everybody stays sensible about it. But we are leaving. That part isn't up for discussion. Behind Louisa, Josie had begun crying, quiet, frightened, the particular sound of a child who understands something is deeply wrong even without understanding what. Louisa's mind raced through options and found almost none of them useful. No neighbor close enough to hear a scream and reach the cabin before these men could act. No weapon in the house beyond a kitchen knife that would do little against two armed men. Nothing except her own voice, and whatever courage she could summon fast enough to matter. If you touch my daughter. Her voice shook, but she didn't let it stop her. I will make sure every person in this territory knows exactly what kind of man sent you here to do it. The taller man's expression flickered, something almost like respect, quickly buried. Mr. Pratt anticipated you might say something along those lines. Told us to assure you it's nothing so dramatic as harm. Simply insurance. Against a particular woman doing something regrettable, in a camp a fair distance from here. Louisa understood then, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful. Billy. Whatever Billy had gotten herself into, whatever this Pratt person believed Billy capable of doing, Louisa and Josie had just become the leverage meant to stop her from doing it. She had no choice, in the end. Not really. Not with Josie crying behind her, and two armed men filling her doorway, and nothing in the small cabin sturdy enough to hold against either of them for long. Let me get her coat. Her voice had steadied, forced into something resembling calm for her daughter's sake, even as everything inside her screamed against it. It's cold on the road tonight. The letter arrived in Miller's Crossing the following evening, exactly as promised, the boy having ridden through most of the night to make good on his $5 extra. He found the cabin dark. Door standing slightly ajar. A half-built arrangement of river stones still scattered across the floor inside, one small stone fence perpetually collapsed, exactly as an 8-year-old girl had left it the evening before. Nobody answered his knock. He waited a while, uncertain, then walked to the general store to ask after Louisa Hart, and learned from a worried shopkeeper that she hadn't shown for work that morning, hadn't been seen by anyone in town since the previous evening, and that 2 strangers had been noticed lingering near her cabin the day before. The boy rode back south immediately, letter still folded in his saddlebag, understanding without needing anyone to explain it to him, that he was now carrying considerably worse news than the errand he'd originally been sent to deliver. Boone found Wyatt Sloane on the second day of riding, camped rough beside a stream some 40 miles east of Harlan's Notch, sitting alone with a small fire, and considerably less certainty about his own future than a man usually carries 3 days into starting one fresh. Sloane looked up when Boone's horse came into the firelight. Didn't reach for a weapon. Just watched, wary, the particular caution of a man who'd learned recently exactly how quickly a room could turn against him. Didn't expect company. Wasn't planning on giving you any. Boone dismounted, stiff from 2 hard days in the saddle. Things have changed back in Harlan's Notch. Figured you'd want to know. Not sure what business it is of mine anymore. Camp made its decision. I rode out same as they asked. Camp's decision wasn't the whole story. Not by a long stretch. Boone crouched by the fire, warming his hands, choosing his words carefully. Turns out Pratt's the one who paid for Sorrel Creek. Same as you told her. And turns out Pratt's already moved against her family up north, a woman and a little girl, connected to the son she lost that night. Sloane went very still. How bad? Don't know yet. Word only just reached camp, before I rode out to find you. Boone met his eyes across the fire. She's going to need everything you remember said out loud, in front of witnesses, if there's any chance of stopping this clean instead of it turning into something worse. Sloane sat with that a long moment, staring into the small fire, something working behind his eyes that Boone couldn't quite read. I told myself riding east meant I was done being part of anything ugly. Quiet. Almost to himself. Told myself I'd earned that, after everything in that saloon. Maybe you had. Except a man doesn't get to decide, when he's done owing something. Sloane looked up, and something had hardened in his face, something closer to resolve than Boone had seen in him, since the confrontation at the Rusted Spur. Not if the owing's real. He was on his feet, before Boone had finished rising himself, kicking dirt over the fire, already moving toward his horse. Then we'd best ride. Boone said it, already climbing back into his own saddle. Because whatever's happening back there, it isn't going to wait on either of us to catch up comfortable. Word reached Billy the following afternoon, carried by the same exhausted boy who'd ridden, through the night to bring it, the cabin found empty, the strangers seen lingering the day before, Louisa and Josie nowhere to be found in all of Miller's Crossing. Billy read the boy's account standing in the middle of the boarding house common room, and felt something inside her chest go entirely, dangerously quiet. Because 8 years ago, she'd come home 2 days late to a burning yard, and a son she couldn't save. She would not, could not, let that particular horror repeat itself, with a granddaughter she'd never even met. Where would he keep them? She said it out loud, though there was nobody in the room qualified to answer except herself. If Pratt wanted leverage, where would he keep them close enough to use, but far enough from camp that nobody would stumble onto it by accident? She was still working, through the geography of it, the outlying claims, the old mining camps abandoned, when their veins ran dry, the handful of structures scattered across the hills surrounding Harlan's Notch, that a careful man might use to hold something he needed kept quiet, when a commotion rose outside on the street. She stepped out onto the porch, and found the answer walking directly toward her, in the worst possible way. 2 riders, the same men who'd stood in Louisa's doorway 2 nights before, leading a small wagon down the center of Harlan's Notch's main road in plain daylight, in full view of the entire camp. Louisa sat in the wagon bed, hands bound loose in front of her, face pale but steady, one arm wrapped protectively around Josie beside her. Behind them, on horseback, rode Augustus Pratt himself. No longer wearing the warm public smile Billy had sat across the dinner table with 2 nights earlier. His face had gone hard, cold, stripped entirely of the careful performance that had built him 4 years of unquestioned trust in this camp. The wagon stopped in the center of the road. The whole camp had begun gathering, miners setting down tools, shopkeepers stepping out, from behind counters, drawn by the particular electric hush that spreads through a small place whenever something is clearly, unmistakably about to happen in public. Pratt sat his horse, unhurried, and let the silence build a moment, before he finally spoke. "Mrs. Hargrove." His voice carried easy across the gathering crowd. "I believe you have some acquaintance with my 2 guests." Billy stepped off the porch. Moved slow, deliberate, every eye in the camp swinging to follow her. "Let them go, Pratt. In good time." He smiled, though it held none of the warmth from 2 nights before. "First, I think this camp deserves to understand exactly what kind of woman they've been celebrating this past week." He turned in the saddle, addressing the crowd now, his voice pitched to carry. "This woman rode into Harlan's Notch claiming to right a wrong. Claiming justice, claiming grief, claiming whatever noble reason suited the story she wanted told." His eyes found Billy again, hard and unblinking. "What she failed to mention is that she's spent 8 years murdering men across 3 territories. 5, by her own admission, given freely in the Rusted Spur not 1 week ago. And now she's brought that particular talent to our camp, threatening to unravel everything decent men have spent years building here, on nothing more than accusation and grief-soaked suspicion." A murmur moved through the crowd. Uncertain. The particular sound of a camp trying to decide, in real time, which version of events it was more willing to believe. "He's the one who paid for the fire." Billy's voice cut through the murmur, steady despite everything happening inside her chest. "Paid 6 frightened kids to burn a ranch that never did him a single wrong, because there was gold underneath it worth more to him than the family living on top. Accusation? Pratt's voice stayed calm, almost gentle, the practiced tone of a man accustomed to being believed. Convenient, isn't it? No proof. No witness beyond a self-confessed murderer, who happens to have vanished east of here, precisely when his testimony might have mattered. He's not vanished. The new voice came, from the edge of the crowd, and every head turned toward it. Wyatt Sloane sat his horse at the boundary of camp, Boone beside him, both men having ridden hard enough in the last stretch, that their horses stood lathered and blowing. Sloane dismounted, walked forward through the parting crowd, with none of the swagger that had once defined him, just a quiet, deliberate steadiness that looked entirely unfamiliar on him. I'm right here. He stopped a few paces from Pratt's horse, looked up at him without flinching. And I'm done keeping quiet about what I know. Pratt's composure held, but something behind his eyes had gone tight. This camp already heard your confession, Mr. Sloane. Heard it, and made its judgment, and walked you out its gates accordingly. Nobody here owes your word a second hearing. Then they can hear it, from somebody else too. Boone stepped forward now, drawing something from inside his coat, a leather-bound ledger, worn at the corners, that he held up for the crowd to see. Found this in your study 2 nights back, Pratt. Every payment you ever made to keep this camp quiet about, where your money really comes from. Names. Dates. 6 of them, from 8 years back, all paid the same week, all from an account you've never once mentioned to a single soul in Harlan's Notch. Pratt's jaw tightened. For the first time, since he'd ridden into camp, something like genuine alarm crossed his face. That ledger was stolen from private property. Maybe so. Boone didn't lower it. Don't reckon that makes what's written inside it any less true. The crowd had gone fully silent now. Every eye moving between Pratt, still mounted, composure fracturing visibly, and the small collection of people arrayed against him, Billy, Sloane, Boone, and now Jed Calloway pushing forward, from the crowd's edge, his own account of stolen claim land ready on his tongue, followed by the faro dealer who'd once described money skimmed under threat, each of them adding their own piece to an accounting that had been building, quietly, for longer than Pratt had apparently realized. Let them go. Billy said it again, quieter this time, though it carried further than a shout might have in the particular silence that had settled over the road. Whatever you decide to do about the rest of this, Pratt, that part isn't negotiable. Not anymore. Pratt looked down at her from his horse. And for one long moment, something calculating moved behind his eyes, the particular look of a man weighing whether violence might still salvage a situation that words had already lost. His hand drifted slow toward the pistol at his hip. Don't. Billy's voice stayed level, but her own hand had already found her revolver, faster than thought, faster than the 8 years of careful patience she'd spent building toward exactly this moment. You've got exactly one choice left, that doesn't end, with you on the ground in front of this entire camp. Let them go. The standoff held a long, breathless moment. The whole road silent except for the creak of the wagon, the soft, frightened breathing of a little girl pressed close against her mother's side. Then, slow, Pratt's hand came away from his weapon. Cut them loose. He said it toward the men flanking the wagon, his voice gone flat, defeated in a way that hadn't touched his face until just now. This isn't finished, Mrs. Hargrove. Whatever you think you've proven here today, it's finished. Boone cut him off, stepping forward, the ledger still held high enough that the whole crowd could see it. This camp's finished pretending not to know what we've all suspected for longer than any of us wanted to admit. The men untied Louisa's hands, helped her and Josie down from the wagon, and Louisa moved immediately toward Billy, one arm still wrapped tight around her frightened daughter, the two women meeting in the center of the road for the first time in 8 years of careful, painful distance. Neither said anything at first. There wasn't a word big enough yet for what needed saying. Billy's eyes moved to Josie. Dark-haired. Caleb's eyes, unmistakably, staring back up at her, with the particular wide caution of a child who'd just survived something she didn't yet have language to fully understand. You're the one from the letters. Josie's voice came out small. Uncertain. Grandma. Something cracked open in Billy's chest at that word. Wider than 8 years of grief had ever quite managed to crack it. That's right. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. That's exactly right. What happened to Augustus Pratt in the moments that followed unfolded the way most things unfolded in a camp, with no formal law of its own, messy, argued over, decided by consensus rather than any court, the crowd splitting into rough factions debating what justice even looked like for a man who'd built himself so thoroughly into the camp's own foundation. Some wanted him strung up right there in the road, the same rough justice that had nearly claimed Sloane a week earlier. Billy wouldn't allow it. She stood in the middle of the gathered crowd, revolver drawn but pointed at nothing, and did the same thing she'd done in the rusted spurs 7 days before. Thumbed open the loading gate. Pressed the cartridges out one at a time, setting them in a slow, deliberate row atop an overturned crate for the whole camp to witness. I spent 8 years believing killing the people responsible would settle something in me. Her voice carried clean across the silent road. It never did. Just left me, with more faces I couldn't stop seeing at night, and at least one of those faces, her voice caught, just slightly, thinking of the fourth name, the letter from Reyes still folded in her saddlebag. At least one of those faces maybe didn't deserve what I gave him. She looked around at the crowd. At faces uncertain what to do, with a woman who just handed them exactly the kind of clean, satisfying vengeance most of them had been quietly hoping for, and refused to take it herself. This man's going to sit under guard until the circuit judge makes his rounds through this territory come spring. That's the law this camp's never bothered building for itself, and it's past time somebody started. She looked directly at Pratt, standing now, stripped of the horse, and the composure both. You'll answer for what you did. Properly. In a courtroom, with the ledger, and the witnesses standing ready. Not strung up on a rope by a crowd that'll feel considerably less certain about it come morning. The camp argued a while longer. But in the end, worn down by the particular exhaustion that follows any long confrontation, and swayed by something in Billy's steady insistence that felt more like real justice than anything Harlan's notch had managed to construct for itself in its short, lawless history, they agreed. Pratt was walked to the same small structure that had briefly held Sloane a week before, guarded now by Jed Calloway, and 2 other miners who'd lost enough to his quiet cruelty over the years to take the responsibility seriously. The camp had, for the first time in its brief existence, built something resembling a proper reckoning. Slower than a hanging. Considerably less immediately satisfying for a crowd that had spent the afternoon primed for something more sudden. But real, in a way the alternative never could have been. Evening settled soft, and gold over Harlan's notch, the same particular light that had greeted Billy's arrival 8 days earlier, though everything about the camp, and everything about her, felt different now in ways she was still working to understand. She sat on the porch steps of the boarding house, with Josie beside her, Louisa a few feet off, watching the two of them, with an expression that carried equal parts caution, and something warmer trying carefully to surface underneath it. You knew my daddy. Josie said it, not quite a question, more a fact she was testing out loud to see how it felt. I did. Billy's voice came out gentle in a way it hadn't sounded in years. Better than almost anybody. He was my son. Mama says he was building something for me, before I was born. Before he even knew about me. Billy went very still. A cradle. Quiet. He was building you a cradle. Josie's eyes went wide. What happened to it? For a long moment, Billy didn't answer. Reached instead into the small pouch she kept always at her belt, the one that had carried, for 8 years, a single charred fragment of unfinished wood, worn smooth now, from years of her own fingers turning it, over in the dark. She held it out. Small, blackened at the edges, one curve of what had once been a rocker still visible in its shape. This is all that's left of it. Her voice caught, but she pushed through anyway. I've carried it 8 years. Never quite knew why exactly. Just knew I couldn't let it go. Josie took it carefully, turning it over in small hands, tracing the curve of the rocker, with one finger. Can I keep it? I think. Billy's voice had gone thick. I think he'd have wanted exactly that. Louisa stepped closer, settling onto the step beside them, close enough now that the three of them sat together in a way that felt, for the first time in 8 impossibly long years, less like grief, and more like something quietly, carefully beginning. I always meant to write more. Billy said it, not quite looking at Louisa, the words costing her something to say out loud. Always told myself the next name would be the last one. That once the list was finished, I'd finally have something worth bringing home to both of you. You could have come anyway. Louisa's voice held no accusation in it. Just a tired, honest sadness. Finished or not. I know that now. Billy looked up, finally, met her eyes fully. Took longer than it should have to understand it. But I know it now. Spring came slow to that country, the way it always did, the snow retreating first, from the low ground, and last from the shaded northern slopes, the road to Miller's Crossing turning soft, and passable somewhere around the middle of March. The circuit judge rode, through exactly when word had promised he would, and Harlan's Notch, for the first time in its brief history, watched something resembling a proper trial unfold in the same rough lumber building that had once hosted little more than card games and cheap whiskey. The ledger spoke for itself, mostly. Sloane's testimony, given clean and steady this time, in front of a judge instead of a saloon crowd, filled in whatever the numbers alone couldn't prove. Boone's own account, offered without excuse, closed whatever gaps remained. Augustus Pratt was found guilty of what the camp had already decided, in its own rough way, that he was guilty of the moment the wagon stopped in the middle of that road, and he was led away, from Harlan's Notch in chains rather than the fine coat he'd once worn, so carefully, the benefactor everyone had trusted revealed, finally and completely, for exactly what he'd always been underneath the performance. Billy didn't stay to watch him go. She'd already seen enough of Augustus Pratt to last whatever years remained to her, and there was somewhere else she needed to be, that particular afternoon, a cabin at the edge of a settlement 2 days north, where a granddaughter she'd waited 8 years to meet was, at that very moment, probably building something out of river stones on the floor, and narrating every piece of it out loud. She rode to Miller's Crossing that April, and she never rode away from it again. Sold what little remained of the old ranch land near Sorrel Creek, used what it brought to build something smaller and quieter on a stretch of ground just outside town, close enough to walk to Josie's school of an afternoon, close enough to sit some evenings on Louisa's porch, and slowly, carefully, begin filling in 8 years of silence with something worth keeping. Some nights, sitting out under a sky scattered thick with stars, the way it always seemed to scatter out there, far from anywhere large enough to dim it, Billy still thought about the fire. Still saw Caleb's face, clear as the morning she'd found him. Still worked, some mornings, to remember exactly what his voice had sounded like laughing, and some mornings, even now, she still couldn't quite get there. But other mornings, she woke to the sound of a granddaughter's footsteps on the porch outside her window, small boots on old wood, and the particular ordinary noise of a family, however newly built, however late in coming, going about the quiet business of simply continuing. And on those mornings, Billy Hargrove finally understood something 8 long years of riding, from one name to the next, had never once managed to teach her. That the weight doesn't fully lift. Not ever, not entirely. Some griefs simply don't work that way, no matter how much a person rides, or how many names they finally settle, or how much distance they put between themselves and the wrong-colored sky that started it all. But a person can learn, given enough time, and enough reason to keep trying, to carry it differently. A little lighter, some mornings than others. Without letting its weight decide, ever again, where she rode to next.